Dr. Chapman mentioned to me that, well, he was delighted to come down and give the introduction. He felt I'd be disappointed in him if he didn't at least tell me he had better things to do today than this. So I appreciate that very much. First of all, thank you for having me back. Some of you may wonder why after the last time I was here, but I actually I find it a privilege and I really appreciate it. The one confession I'll make in advance, and you will determine this on your own by the end, that I get paid to manage money, not to give speeches, and it'll be apparent. But what this opportunity has afforded me, and the reason why I'm anxious to accept, is that it does force you to organize your thinking. It does force you to pause long enough to contemplate whether there is actually something you want to talk about. While I do tend to leave these things to the last minute, last night felt great, so I got it together. Again, and I'd also like to thank my parents for coming and bringing all their friends. That room would feel half empty, I suspect, if they didn't, so that's great. And I also wanted to welcome my new colleagues and friends from Ernst & Young and from Western for coming. We've moved our business from Toronto down to London to work with Ernst & Young, which for a whole bunch of reasons, but the main one was the quality of work that they deliver, not us. The first thing, just as a preamble to this, is I said, it's a treacherous time to stand up in front of an audience and profess to be able to explain what is going on in the world, or provide a prescription for what we need to do to fix everything. It's complicated and not only difficult, but most likely impossible. But that does not mean that we should stop thinking about it or stop talking about it. In fact, we should insist that our political leaders lead the discussion and hopefully inspire us all to take action. So today I plan on addressing the issue of Canada's future and whether we are in fact talking about the right things. 7 years ago, in the New Hampshire primaries, a charismatic candidate that you all know gave a speech that resonated strongly. You're all familiar with it, but let me remind you of its power. And I quote, "For when we have faced down impossible odds, when we have been told we're not ready, or that we wouldn't try, or that we can't, generations have responded with a simple creed that sums up the spirit of a people. Yes, we can." It was a creed written into the founding documents that declared the destiny of a nation. Yes, we can. It was whispered by slaves and as they blazed a trail towards freedom through the darkest of nights. It was sung by immigrants as they struck out from distant shores and pioneers who pushed westward against the unforgiving wilderness. Yes, we can. It was the call of workers who organized, women who reached for the ballot, a president who chose the moon as our new frontier, and a king who took us to a mountaintop and pointed the way for a promised land. Yes, we can, to opportunity and prosperity. Yes, we can to heal this nation. And yes, we can repair this world. Yes, we can. No doubt incredibly inspiring words even now, when the reality of the Obama presidency that followed may have been less compelling. I would, however, submit that if Barack Obama had been a disappointment, it may have been as much to do with the mechanics of governing a dysfunctional system than with personal failure on his part. But regardless of one's view of him, to me what's important is to remember how he got the job. Obama's victory wasn't won by debating the finer points of fiscal policy. It wasn't about head counts in Iraq or states' right on key social issues. All of those things mattered, of course, but he won, and young Americans rose up in record numbers to support because of big ideas. Big, simple, and very inspiring ideas. As we as Canadians contemplate a federal election, I ask, are we being offered that kind of inspiration? Is there a vision out there for the kind of country we want to have? I would argue that not one of our federal parties is doing that job. So, what do Canadians have a right to hear from the political leaders? What should we be insisting upon hearing? What should we be talking about? Well, whatever you may think of it, you probably wouldn't put a debate about a deficit at the top of an inspiration file. Our federal leaders are dancing on the head of a pin. In a $2 trillion economy, a deficit of a few billion or a surplus of a few billion is just simply meaningless. It's probably impossible to measure. Former finance ministers will tell you that the sheer amount of guesswork and real-time budgeting makes all of these debates pointless. Only in hindsight do we really know how the economy fared. So why does this seem to take up all the airtime? Why are political leaders talking about staying the course rather than charting a course? I think we would all agree that this is hardly a time for a caretaker government. We have just experienced 25 years of no growth in middle-class income, escalating healthcare costs, and reduced funding of education, especially to universities and post-secondary institutions. The issues we face as a nation are very serious, and some have long-term consequences. The solutions aren't easy, but the payoff and the potential is enormous. Some of them are domestic in nature, and so are the solutions. Others are far beyond our control, but with direct ramifications on our prospects and our prosperity. Let's start with some of the issues beyond our control and how we might prepare for them. Top of mind in recent weeks, of course, is China. The engine of the world's growth in the past decade, China was responsible almost single-handedly for the creation of the commodity supercycle, as it consumed vast amounts of materials, fueling its growth and building infrastructure that helped transform its population from a majority rural agrarian one to an economy of urban dwellers with a growing and vibrant middle class. The Chinese miracle, including how the centralized economy managed through recessions and credit crises, offset almost total weakness in the rest of the world. As a result, China's slowdown was inevitable. It was predictable, and frankly, it was visible for a long time. It isn't so much that the global markets and investors were absolutely shocked by China's slowdown as the fact that the slowdown is uncovering some internal structural problems inside China that is cause for concern and the stability of the world. Stock markets didn't sell off in late August because China's stock market matters particularly, and they didn't sell off because internal domestic economic turmoil will affect other countries directly, because it won't. In fact, China is quite isolated in terms of economic contagion. But if it doesn't keep growing, the fear is that from iron ore to iPhones, the world will slow, and so markets tanked. Let's take Europe for a moment. Even without regard to the refugee crisis that we read about every day, the continent remains a cause for concern. The Greek bailout that we spent our summers reading about has come and gone, without much attention being paid to the fact that it didn't work. That is, its financial obligations and shortfalls have simply been papered over, but it's not all clear that Greece won't find itself in precisely the same position in a matter of months as new chunks of liabilities come due. Greece, of course, in and itself is unimportant economically. A tiny economy, it is also one against whom most of the European banks have been inoculated. But Greece will test the European Union and will also test investors' faith in larger, arguably more influential economies such as Spain and Italy. For now, Europeans remain on the back burner, simmering, but it would be a huge mistake to ignore the risk to the Canadian economy. A genuine credit crisis in Eurozone would have a devastating effect on the world. We can talk about the extreme instability of some formerly high-flying Latin American economies, and also about the potential for the United States to miss its growth targets. Or we could talk about Russia and the Ukraine, a problem that seemed to capture the world's attention that we have put behind us. But those are less real and present dangers today and more what we call our categories of concern. So those are some of the external risks that Canada faces, issues that any party or any leader should have strong, clear policy and responses to. To isolate ourselves from these issues is to totally ignore the fact that our livelihood and our prosperity is inextricably linked to the prosperity of the rest of the world and how we respond to them. But what about the internal issues that require our vision and leadership? Those are sadly familiar. In fact, the challenges we face as a nation aren't new. Some of them are decades old, some of them older. First, we are far too reliant on our extraction industries. There is no question Canada has abundant natural resources, and the wealth generated from that natural gift has stood us in good stead for generations. In the past decade, this hasn't just been a good thing, it has actually transformed us and our sense of ourselves. In a commodity supercycle, we have become a superpower. We grew royalties and profits on the back of very little incremental labor or productivity gains. That is why our currency trades almost against the commodity cycle. So when the supercycle turns downward, it becomes clear that Canada needs a plan B. The trouble in Canada, unfortunately, is that our other most important sector, manufacturing, is also in decline. Unlike commodity prices, the slow structural decline in manufacturing has been 3 decades in the making, and with some exceptions, is unlikely to rebound. Canada has been manufacturing goods, especially assembling goods, for the US market for generations. Our close proximity and good trade relationship made the market easy to exploit. In turn, a skilled labor force, common contract law, and for many periods in our history, a currency advantage made us extremely attractive to US neighbors as a place to manufacture goods. But does any of that mean that we really became good at manufacturing? I would argue no. In fact, quite the opposite. Though it worked for a long time, 1 or 2 of those advantages are removed, like currency advantage. We know that manufacturing shifts from Canada rapidly. For a long time, it was to low-cost labor in far-flung places like China and Vietnam. Now, even parts of the United States can compete on labor and productivity, and Mexico and Latin America are giving Canada a run for its money. The question then becomes, why did we not grow our earlier advantage in manufacturing and exporting to the United States into larger and more diversified export capabilities that would help us grow today? An example of not being foresighted. Once manufacturing shifts, it is very hard to entice back. We therefore must ask, does Canada have the basic elements that make us a good place to build things? Our labor force is rigid and expensive. We are, however, highly educated and yet remain less productive than workers in other parts of the world, including the United States and Mexico. So, pinning our hopes on the country winning back manufacturing seems like a challenging idea unless there is a new way to achieve it. So, what are the policies our leaders might pursue in the face of all these challenges? First, on commodities. We've had a welcome wake-up call, and it may continue. It is time to diversify our customer base beyond our neighbors to the south. Yes, that means we need to build pipelines. And on that front, true leadership might look a bit different from what we've seen. I'm completely agnostic on which pipelines we build, but I would submit to you that if the great linking device of our transcontinental railway, that shining link between Nova Scotia and British Columbia, were being planned today, it wouldn't have a hope in hell of succeeding. Given visions require great visions require great leadership. If something is important enough, galvanizing the support you need for it can be done. Think of the tens of thousands of Canadians who signed up to fight in 2 world wars on another continent. They didn't do that for the adventure, and most were conscripted. They weren't driven by a sense of purpose or a sense of destiny. Words persuaded them. Ideas persuaded them. And we can't get a pipeline built. Second, manufacturing doesn't need to die in Canada, but we need to ground ourselves in reality. What product would we say we produce better than others? What service can we be good at? That's the one we should focus on and invest in and exploit. Is there a reason why we can't lead the world in science and technology and the manufacturing capabilities that go with it? We discovered stem cells in Canada. Could we lead the world in regenerative medicine, an area that many believe will transform healthcare globally? If we are to be manufacturers, how will we rise above the challenge the sector faces? Will we need to reduce wages? Will we need new technology? Or will a real hard look at investment and productivity be the answer? The important thing is we've got to look at the questions. Third, while we all too often ignore one of Canada's most important sectors, and that is agriculture. How important is agriculture to our economy? It is potentially the biggest sector in the country, worth billions of dollars. And yet, we continue to allow our policymakers treat it like a cottage industry, a collection of mom and pop shops across the country. I would like to hear real leadership about how Canada can become an agri-power. Why not export not just our wheat and canola, but our know-how, our technology, and our capability to feed the world? Why not become the world's leading developer, marketer, and producer of food? It's something we're already good at, we're world-class at, and yet it gets a fraction of the attention of lesser sectors like oil and gas. A fourth area of focus in Canada might be service. If this country excels at something, it is service. Whether that's public sector, healthcare, or private sector, we're really good at it. Service is also one of the most vibrant job creation machines in any economy. You might not know that service makes up 70% of our GDP. That's over 2/3 of our economy. And service puts educated people to work, and it creates high-paying jobs. And yet, our thought leaders spend very little time talking about or creating supportive policies towards our service sector. One example that should be a model of what Canada can do is to export healthcare and education. Our country, for all we like to complain about, has one of the best healthcare and education systems on the planet, and within it, some of the most talented individuals. It's early and fraught with bureaucratic difficulty, but both are experimenting with the export of some of that expertise. Why not offset growing cost footprints in healthcare and education with new revenue sources and help people around the world at the same time? So if those are four areas we might concentrate or might concern ourselves with, what are some of the policies we might hear from our visionary leaders? What about education? We talk a lot about it, but if you send your children to grade 1 today, she will sit in the same desk that you sat in and take instruction in the same way. We know we're failing our kids. We know we need to revamp of not just the methods, but the content of how we teach. And yet, nothing happens. It's not just too bad, it's a colossal mistake that risks our very prosperity. Healthcare takes up a lot of airtime. It's important to all of us. We're all interested, and let's face it, it will occupy a big and growing share of our taxes for many years to come. But the conversation, quite frankly, has been hijacked by insiders and interested parties. Here's one simple suggestion that we might use to attack both. Instead of talking about costs, how about we start talking about prices? A simple mind shift that will make an enormous difference. The cost for a radiologist, and I'm not picking on radiologists, to examine a piece of film has absolutely plummeted in the past decade. And in fact, it's no longer film, it's all digital. Yet, the price of that radiologist has not just stayed the same, it has escalated over the decade. No other service industry operates a model where falling cost of production isn't passed on to the customer. That simple shift in thinking would wring billions of savings out of the system, all money that could be better spent elsewhere. We know we must develop new curriculum and teaching methods to meet the needs of the future, but to achieve that, we must eliminate some past practices and find new ways to deliver more education to more people at less cost. We need to have a vision to support business. We need investment-friendly places to attract global centers of excellence, whether that is tax incentives or support through infrastructure. Government can't do it on their own and shouldn't promise to try. So, can Canada be the greatest country on earth? I happen to think it is. But, like our vast natural resource wealth, we have gifts that are only worthwhile if we do something with them. This country has vast human gifts lying fallow. We have a tolerant and diversified society that is well educated and is at the envy of the world. And rather than hearing messages of inspiration from the people fighting to lead this nation, we hear quibbling about the size of a deficit. Barack Obama inspired Americans with the simple message that they are people who can believe in themselves. Yes, we can isn't a prompt, it's a reminder. And remember, America is a country with problems far more complex and far deeper and far more intransient than any that we face. We don't have systemic racism. For all of its flaws, we don't have a broken education system or patchy healthcare that fails up to 25% of the population. But maybe, just maybe, we don't believe we have a burning platform either. The answer, I believe, is two-pronged. Demanding the leadership we deserve, and that's one that you and I and everyone can have a part in. And the starting point for that leadership should be a real passion for this place, Canada. Leaders who aren't afraid to be embarrassingly in love with Canada and hugely aspirational about our future. And two, we must support those leaders to dream big and take the hard decisions that will ensure our prosperity for decades to come, not simply years. It's a big job, I don't underestimate it, and what these politicians are asking for is important. They should think big, feel deeply about Canada and their vision for it, and we should accept nothing less. Thank you.